the development of football through time, Unit 12, P1M1. How the game was developed and moved on from way back. First, we're going to start 300 BC. This is where the game of Cuju happened in China. This is where two poles suspended a hoop above, and you had to chip the ball into the hoop. And you had two players on each side that went against each other. Then we move on to the 12th and 16th century. This is where whole villages play football against each other with a pico palada as the football. Then we move on to the 16th century Italy. This is where the game Calico Florentino happened. This is where 54 players on each side played against each other with a ball and a goal. The aim was to hurt your opponents and get through them. To develop the football continued, this is where in 1891 penalty kicks and linesmen were first introduced. And in 1984 Brazil was taken by storm by Scotsmen. In 1914 football became popular with males, but World War I games quickly taken over by women in 1914 and 1921 because men were at war fighting and women had to kill spare time, which means football was mainly popular with them so they could entertain their spare time while the men were fighting war. In 1930 the first World Cup was introduced in Uruguay and European teams didn't show up. Now we have agricultural society, otherwise known as mob football. Through agricultural society, people started to create games which would keep them occupied in their free time. Some games are still played today. Mob football is where there are thousands of people fighting over one ball. Goals are 3 miles apart each side, and only one goal will surpass. The game lasts as long as one team takes the score. We also have cheese rolling. This is where a block of cheese is thrown down a hill, and you have to run down the hill after it. Now we have the Industrial Revolution, 1846. Industrial Revolution had an impact on the game of football as transport became more available, meaning people could get from place to place and games to games easier and more efficiently now, so they didn't have to cost a lot of money, which means it brought other towns and cities together, meaning they could play more football. As well as this, teams like Arsenal FC, West Ham and Sheffield were all created from factories happening in the Industrial Revolution. Between the time of 1870 and 1888, 15 English sides were created with 3 of the teams above, which I just mentioned. In 1846, the work act was introduced, meaning you could only work for a certain amount of hours and then you had to have time off, which then gave more spare time for teams and football to happen as you had more time to play it. Now it's World War I. 100 years ago, in 1914, it was just the same. Thousands played everywhere and thousands watched football. When World War broke out, football didn't just go away. World War I would be unlike anything that had come before. Most of the countries were drawn into the fighting, whether at home or on the front. This is a story of how football would play its part too. One English club called Harrogate Town were meant to play their first ever match on the 5th of September 1914, but the match was cancelled due to the outbreak of war. Now to the 20th century. In 1905, Chelsea FC did not exist until two brothers built a stadium inspired by Scottish stadiums like Celtic Park. This is important as the ground was in London and attracted a lot of important games, like the Cup Final through the years of 1920 to 1922. This is the time frame where most cups started to be held in stadiums of importance, like the Champions League Final is held in the country of the last winner today. In 1909, spectators swarmed onto the field, uprooted the goals, cut up the turf and finally set fire to the pay boxes and other buildings because the game ended in a draw between Celtic and Rangers. This was one of the eldest tales of hooliganism, and in the years between 1970 and 1980, hooliganism mixed with poor policy and an old stadium caused the death of 39 Juventus fans in 1985 in the European Cup Final. This led to English teams being banned from Europe for 5 years and Liverpool, the club involved, being banned for 6. Now you've got the 1860s and 1870s. 1848 was the first ruling of football, which was introduced by Cambridge University. Then we move on to 1870, which saw the first goalkeeper happen. As well as that, in the same year, the passing game was invented instead of the dribbling game. So now passing was more involved in the game instead of just picking the ball up and running with it. In 1871, the FA Cup was invented, and in 1875, the first crossbar happened. In 1877, the first 90-minute game happened, and in 1878, the first referees were introduced. Now until the 1880s and 1890s. 1885, professional football was allowed now, so it was seen as an occupation and a job, instead of just playing it for fun. In 1888, the Football League was introduced, where now professional leagues were playing, and you're now in a proper league. proper scoreboard and table. In 1888, Preston North End won the first ever league. In 1891, penalty kicks were introduced, as well as in 1891, linesmen were now being introduced. 1900. In 1904, FIFA was introduced. FIFA was founded. This is where they came together and became an organisation so they could manage football. In 1907, PFA was introduced. This is where all owners of football clubs and managers could come together and speak about football and how they think they could improve it. In 1944, physical education was established, which means in schools you had to now do PE and sport so that they could get most out of it. In 1954, UEFA was formed. This was where European leagues now could happen, which brought teams from all over the countries together so they could play one cup. In 1958, this was Munich air disaster. This is where Manchester United were playing and a plane crashed, killing several teams of the Manchester United team. It was a massive disaster. In 1965, English Sports Council was formed. In 1966, England won the World Cup. This was the first major tournament and ever tournament England won as a country. In 1985, all English teams were banned abroad because of the Juventus thing I explained earlier. In 1989, Hillsborough disaster happened. This is where fans were all crammed into one stand and the stand collapsed, being killed several hundred people. In 1922, the Premier League was first invented, and in 1955, the Boss Scramble was invented. Organisations of football. You have the National Governing Body, this is where it protects things. So the National Governing Body for football is the FA. FA was introduced in 1863 and they aimed to deliver effective and professional organisation for greater football of English football. UEFA was invented in 1954 and they were a union of European teams to bring together through football, for example, the Champions League and the Europa League. Then in 1992 you have the LMA. They represents all the voices of the managers in the English leagues. Then in 1904 FIFA was introduced to improve football and make it better for everyone to play. And in 1907 you have the PFA. The aim of the PFA was to protect and improve and negotiate conditions, rights and status of all professional players by collective bargaining agreements. Other organisations that are in sport are the Sport England, which was introduced in 1997. They focus on helping people to get into sport through projects in the community, like what we're doing now. Also you have National Lottery. This was invented in 1994. This helps local communities through football or other sports. Projects are in the local area so it can take kids off the street and get them involved in playing football, meaning it reduces the rate of knife crime and run on the streets and brings local communities together. Then you have UK Sport. This was invented in 1997. UK Sport provides strategic investments to enable Great Britain's Olympic and Paralympic sports and athletes to achieve their full winning potential. Then you have the Department of Culture, Media and Sport 1997. This is responsible for the culture and sport in the UK. They are also responsible for broadcasting sporting events throughout the UK. Finally, you have the Central Council for Physical Recreation in 1978. The organisation speaks and acts to promote, protect and develop the interests of sport and physical recreation at all levels. It is completely independent of any form of government control, has no responsibility for allocating funds, is strictly non-party in support or oppose proposed measures and only on the basis of their perceived value of sport and recreation.
Well done, mate. Brilliant. Hold it there a minute. Right. There's a little bit on the influence of public schools, yeah? But can you tell us a bit more? So what actually happened with football?
Firstly, in public schools there was disagreement because some people wanted to play football where you grab the ball and run around with it, and there's some people that wanted to use their feet to kick the ball. So this is where football was invented. They sat down and agreed that there was to be two sports. One would be named as football, where you just use your feet, and then there also used to be one named as now rugby, where you use your hands, but obviously it changed the shape of the ball.
Good stuff. Anything else, mate? Yeah.
That's it. Stuff on organisations is good. I think we covered most of them with good information, so it was just that really.
Yeah, I thought it was good, mate. Just, when you do your presentation, just make sure you got some pictures on there as well that can help you. Yeah?
And you talk about 110 miles an hour.
Yeah, slow your speech down a bit.